Hey everyone, my name is Richard and today I will be taking a look back at the 2019 Lenovo Ideapad S340. Now when the S340 first launched, it was kind of like a low-powered and budget laptop for entry-level users. And I've been using this device for quite a while now, so I just want to share with you guys some of my overall thoughts on the performance, the build quality, and if you're in the market for a very affordable laptop, if this one is worth considering. Because you can find this for around $200 to $250 on sites like eBay right now. Now I just want to go ahead and say that if you're looking for a laptop that can handle intensive tasks like video editing or gaming, then I probably would not recommend this, only because the specs are a bit dated by this point. But if you're just looking for a generic laptop that can handle schoolwork or everyday web browsing, then definitely give this one a look, because it's a very low price right now. But yeah, here's my review for the Ideapad S340. So I think a good place to start off would be the specs for this laptop. Now there are a lot of configurations that you can get, but for my device I got the Core i3-8145U with UHD 620 graphics. This was a dual-core Whiskey Lake CPU with 4 threads, and even though that does not sound impressive at all given today's standards, it's definitely still very snappy and capable for everyday tasks like web browsing. Stepping it up, you can get the Core i5-8265U, which was a quad-core 8-thread CPU, or the Core i7-8565U, which was also a quad-core CPU, but it had a higher clock speed and a more powerful integrated graphics chip. Newer S340s are also configurable with 10th generation Intel or 3rd generation Ryzen CPUs. So if those are available, I definitely get those over the traditional 8th generation parts from Intel, since they will be faster due to a newer architecture. My laptop also came with 8GB of RAM, 4 of which is soldered to the motherboard and the other 4 is discrete. It also comes with a 256GB Western Digital M.2 NVMe SSD, although some models have a traditional hard drive, which I would avoid getting due to the vastly lower loading speeds. So these displays are pretty interesting. My laptop came with a 1080p 60Hz IPS display, but there are also TN displays available, which again I would strongly recommend avoiding due to the poor viewing angles compared to the IPS display. Okay, so moving on to the exterior of the laptop. It has a pretty clean and minimal design and comes with a black finish, but some models have a silver finish as well. Fingerprints unfortunately do show up pretty easily, but they can always be cleaned with a regular piece of cloth. The laptop also has the standard Lenovo keyboard layout with a number pad to the right. And overall, I think it's a pretty good keyboard, and my model has the white backlight. I actually find the extra number pad to be pretty useful in applications like Blender that can take advantage of the extra keys for shortcuts and such. And here's a sound sample to give you an idea of how it sounds like to type on the S340. The trackpad has a pretty glossy finish with Windows Precision drivers, and just like the keyboard, I have no problems using it whatsoever, and the clicks feel stable. The finish uses this grimy material, and again, fingerprints do show up pretty easily, but in terms of the actual durability, I haven't noticed any wearing or discoloration, and it generally holds up fairly well. The screen is made out of this glossy matte material, and it also has a touchscreen, which is pretty uncommon for a laptop of this price. And like I said before, if it's possible, definitely get the IPS screen over the TN one for the better viewing angles. The screen can also be opened up to 180 degrees, and it does get rather bright at 100% brightness. There is also a webcam at the top of the screen bezel that has a red privacy shutter, which in my opinion is definitely something that should be included on more laptops. The ports on the S340 are fairly standard for a laptop of this size. On the left you have a power jack, an HDMI port, a single USB-C port that does not support Thunderbolt, and an audio jack. On the right there are 2 USB-A ports, and the first one supports USB charging, an SD card reader, and a battery power LED. And the laptop does not come with an Ethernet port, so if you want to use that, you'll have to use an adapter. Oh yeah, and the whole laptop comes in at around 1.79 kilograms or 3.95 pounds, so it's pretty easy to carry around if needed. There's not much going on the bottom of the laptop, just an area where the fans vent out. And if you want to get inside, you have to remove the backplate, which is held on with some torque screws. And once you're inside, you have access to the components: the CPU, heatsink, and fan. The single module of upgradable RAM is under the metal shroud, the M.2 SSD, and the Wi-Fi card. There are a few upgrade options available on the S340. So the first one would be the RAM, and since there's 4GB of solder memory, you can actually upgrade it to a total of 20GB with a separate 16GB module. This actually makes the RAM run in what is called Intel Flex mode, where the 4GB of solder memory and the 4GB on the module run in dual channel, while the extra 8GB on the module runs in single channel. The hard drive will be located here on configurations that don't have the M.2 drive. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about the actual performance of this laptop, and this consists of things like the power profiles, thermals, battery life, and gaming and productivity benchmarks. When it comes to the power and thermal performance, the S340 has 3 different modes that you can switch between with the Lenovo Vantage software. Intelligent mode, which automatically adjusts the fan profile based on what programs you're using, performance mode, and cool and quiet mode. And you can quickly switch between them with the function Q shortcut. All power and thermal performance tests were done with the cool and quiet modes and performance modes on the Lenovo Vantage software, but only performance mode was used for the games and productivity benchmarks. In the 5-minute Intel XQ stress test, the CPU in performance mode reached a maximum of 88 degrees, while the average temperature was 80 degrees. In cool and quiet mode, the maximum temperature of the CPU was 85 degrees, but the average temperature was much cooler at only 71 degrees. This makes more sense when you take a look at the packaged GDP of the CPU over time. In both performance and cool and quiet modes, the CPU was drawing between 21 and 23 watts of power. But once Intel's PL2 turbo timeframe ended, performance mode was limited to 15 watts, while cool and quiet mode was even lower at 11 watts. In turn, this also translates into both modes having similar CPU clock speeds in the beginning at around 3.7 GHz. But once the turbo ends, the CPU was hovering around 3.2 GHz in performance mode, and only 2.7 GHz in cool and quiet mode. So in the end, I think that the thermal performance is decent on this laptop, and I didn't notice anything particularly bad about the cooling system. And if you're doing anything intensive, you should definitely be using performance mode. Getting into the battery life, I feel like this is where things get kind of complicated in terms of a purchase recommendation for the S340. Now, just as some background, Tech actually did a review of the S340 when it first came out a few years ago, and he was able to get around 14 hours of battery life while having the screen at 50% brightness and watching YouTube videos. Now, when I ran the same test, I was only getting around 7 hours and 30 minutes of battery life. And initially, I was extremely confused about this because I thought I was somehow messing up the power settings, but it turns out, after looking on the official spec sheet on the Lenovo website, the Ideapad S340 has 2 different batteries in it. One model has the 36 watt-hour battery, while the other model has the 52.5 watt-hour battery. And it turns out that my device has the 36 watt-hour battery, hence a lower than expected battery life. And this is kind of disappointing because Tech's laptop actually had a more powerful CPU in it, the Core i5-8265U, but it gets a longer battery life than mine because of the larger battery inside it. And the problem is, when you're purchasing this device online, you don't really get to see whether it has a 36 or 52.5 watt-hour battery. So if I had to name a disadvantage of the S340, I would definitely say that it's the battery life on the 36 watt-hour models. 7.5 hours of battery life is fine, and it'll last you for most of the day. But again, it's just very disappointing because the hardware in this laptop is not very powerful, so you'd expect that it would have a much longer battery life than this. Starting off in Cinebench R20, I'm getting 369 points on the single core test and 690 points on the all-core test. The all-core workload score is very low, but again, that's to be expected with a dual-core CPU that launched more than 3 years ago. The Blender BMW benchmark shows pretty much the same situation, taking 20 minutes and 23 seconds in total. Now, just for fun, I decided to test some games on the Ideapad S340, and the 4 games that I selected were Valorant, CSGO, Rocket League, and City Skylines. Now, all 4 games were tested at the lowest possible settings, but in Rocket League I kept ambient occlusion and depth of field on. The 4 games were tested at 1080p, 768p, and 720p resolution. Frame rates in Valorant were actually quite promising if you want to play it on this device. With 1080p low settings, I was getting on average 49 frames per second, and that increased even further at 768p resolution with 72 FPS. At 720p, I managed to get 78 FPS. And this is possible because Valorant is not a very intensive game by any means and can be run on low-end hardware surprisingly well. Moving on to CSGO, I was getting an average of 26 FPS at 1080p, 41 FPS at 786p, and lastly 62 FPS at 720p. Rocket League is kind of an interesting one. I've always thought that this game would run fine on lower end hardware, but that seems to not be the case. 25 FPS at 1080p, 34 FPS at 768p, and 36 FPS at 720p. City Skylines is kind of like the outlier game here. I only add this because I play it pretty often, but realistically most people buying this device probably won't play it. With a population of 10,000 at 1080p, I was getting only 15 FPS on average, and at 720p I was getting 26 FPS on average. So to wrap up this review, I think I'll give you guys some of my final thoughts on the S340. Now, as mentioned in the beginning, I do think that this is a great laptop for those who can't spend over $300, but still want a decent Windows device that can handle everyday tasks. I would say that the biggest drawback is definitely the battery life. 7 to 8 hours really isn't all that impressive given the low power specs for this laptop. But again, some models do have the higher wattage battery, so in general it's not a huge deal breaker for the S340. If you're playing games, you'll mainly be limited to non-intensive titles like Valorant or some casual Steam games. But yeah, that concludes my review for the S340. This is actually my first ever YouTube video, so if you guys have any suggestions or questions, please leave them below in the comments and I will answer them as soon as possible. I hope you guys have enjoyed watching this review, and I'll see you guys in my next video.